1941. British losses exceeded 400,000 tons of shipping per month. The sea lanes became graveyards of twisted metal. For the Allies, this was not merely a naval crisis. It was existential. Britain imported the majority of its food and fuel. Without the convoys, it would starve. Churchill would later admit that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat threat. His government poured desperate energy into protecting the merchant routes, coordinating escort groups, and developing improved detection systems. Yet for much of 1940 and 1941, the technological balance remained against them. Meanwhile, Dönitz refined his command system from bunkers deep under occupied France. U-boats operated through encrypted radio transmissions using the Enigma machine, which gave them real-time coordination across the Atlantic. A single signal from BDU, the U-boat command, could divert dozens of submarines toward a reported convoy. The wolf pack would assemble in a semicircle, each boat surfacing at night to attack. The results were devastating. Convoys lost dozens of ships in single nights, and the ocean seemed to belong to Germany. But even as the U-boat war reached its height, subtle changes were forming beneath the surface of Allied operations. In British laboratories and American naval yards, engineers were quietly rethinking how the ocean could be used not merely as a battlefield, but as an instrument of detection. The human ear had limits. Machines did not. Experiments with multiple hydrophone arrays, continuous echo pulses, and frequency modulation hinted that sonar might do more than reveal a submarine's presence. It could track it, hold it, even through evasive maneuvers. The Atlantic War was becoming not just a battle of endurance, but of innovation. Each side listened to the same sea, but heard different things. And by late 1941, the Atlantic began to whisper signs of a new phase. One in which the hunter might soon discover that the ocean itself had turned against him. As 1941 turned into 1942, the balance of power on the Atlantic waves began to shift, quietly at first, like the slow turning of a tide. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and with it came a vast industrial and scientific force, unlike anything the world had seen. Shipyards along the American coast roared to life, launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. But while production filled the seas with new hulls, the real transformation came from something less visible. The growing sophistication of the escort forces that protected those ships. At the start of the war, most escort vessels were hastily converted destroyers or small corvettes, limited in range and equipment. They carried depth charges and primitive sonar, but coordination between ships was minimal. A single destroyer might make contact, lose it after one run, and then grope blindly for hours. But by 1942, new tactics emerged from the lessons written in steel and blood. The Royal Navy and the newly formed U.S. Navy escort groups began operating in tight-knit formations, with specialized vessels built specifically for anti-submarine warfare, destroyer escorts, frigates, and corvettes equipped with improved sonar sets, radar, and radio direction finders. The technology behind these systems evolved rapidly. The British Type 144 ASDIC and the American QGB sonar could now sweep wider arcs and distinguish false echoes from true ones. Combined with Huff-Duff, or high-frequency direction finding, Allied escorts could triangulate the position of U-boats even when they transmitted short radio bursts to headquarters. What had once been a blind ocean was slowly being mapped through sound and mathematics. Still, 1942 was a grim year. The German U-boat arm surged westward in what Dönitz called the second happy time. With America still organizing coastal defenses, U-boats prowled off the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean, sinking tankers within sight of city lights. Oil fires lit the night skies over New Jersey, and survivors washed ashore by the hundreds. Yet amid this tragedy, the Allies were learning faster than their enemy realized. Each sinking brought more data, sonar readings, debris analyses, acoustic profiles. Scientists and sailors began to speak a common language, one of decibels, frequencies, and echo returns. In Washington, London, and Ottawa, research centers coordinated their findings. The Americans focused on mass production of improved sonar transducers and the development of the sonar dome, a smooth housing under a ship's bow that allowed continuous scanning even at speed. The British advanced the tactical application of sonar through the Western Approaches Command, where escort captains trained relentlessly to interpret faint contacts amid the chaos of battle. Soon, convoy defense was no longer reactive, it was proactive. Escorts began forming deliberate search patterns, trading sonar data across radio channels, and maintaining constant acoustic coverage over entire convoys. For U-boat commanders, this change was almost invisible until it was too late. They still believed in the wolf pack, still trusted that darkness and depth meant safety. They did not yet understand that the ocean itself had been turned into an instrument. Each propeller beat, each pressure wave, each whispered ping carried meaning to the men listening above. By the end of 1942, Allied escorts were no longer merely guarding the convoys. They were hunting. New weapons followed the sonar's lead. Ahead-throwing mortars, known as hedgehog projectors, allowed ships to attack without losing contact, hurling explosives that detonated only on impact. It was precision, not saturation. And it worked. The first months of 1943 marked the beginning of the end for the U-boat's supremacy. Convoy battles like ONS-5 demonstrated a new reality. Coordinated escort groups could track and destroy submarines even in dense wolfpack attacks. German losses began to climb sharply. For every freighter that went down, 2 or 3 U-boats were being sunk. The hunters were bleeding. In Berlin and Paris, Dönitz's staff sensed something changing, but could not yet see how completely the balance had reversed. Reports arrived of submarines vanishing without distress calls, of crews that never surfaced. Something beneath the waves, unseen, unheard, was stalking them. The Battle of the Atlantic was entering its decisive phase. The machines of detection, once crude and uncertain, were evolving into the most formidable weapon the Allies possessed: knowledge. And within months, that knowledge would turn the North Atlantic into a graveyard of steel. To understand how the tide turned beneath the Atlantic waves, one must see the war from every side of its struggle, from the men who hunted, the men who hid, and the machines that listened in between. The story of sonar's rise was not only about circuits and transmitters. It was also about human endurance, fear, and the quiet war of nerves fought inside steel hulls on both sides of the ocean. For the men of the U-boat fleet, the Atlantic was a living presence, vast, cold, and unforgiving. They called it the Grey Wolf's Ocean, a place where courage was measured not by victory, but by survival. Each patrol began with music and ceremony in the French bases of Lorient or Saint-Nazaire. Women waved, bands played, and young sailors believed they were sailing to glory. Yet as the harbor walls faded behind them, silence replaced celebration. Inside the submarine, every sound mattered. The clang of a wrench, the whisper of air through a valve, all could betray them. For weeks they lived without sunlight, sleeping beside torpedoes, rationing air and food, and enduring crushing pressure that tested the limits of human nerves. When sonar pings began echoing through the hull, it felt like being seen by an invisible eye. Each metallic pulse seemed to pierce the skin of the boat itself. Men froze, counting the seconds between pings, praying the escort ships would turn away. These crews were not reckless villains, as wartime propaganda sometimes painted them. They were disciplined, often young, most under 25, trained to believe in precision and endurance. Their captains studied the sea like mathematicians, gauging sound layers, temperature, and thermoclines to hide from detection. Many were skilled enough to slip beneath convoys, fire their torpedoes, and vanish undetected. But by WWII 1942, these same calculations began failing. Echoes grew sharper, depth charges more precise. The ocean's familiar rhythms betrayed them. What had once been a silent refuge had turned into an acoustic trap. Above them, on the decks of Allied escort vessels, a different kind of war unfolded, one waged through patience and coordination. The sonar operators were often young sailors, trained to interpret faint echoes amid miles of noise. They sat in dimly lit rooms, headphones pressed tight, listening to the ocean's murmur. Each contact began as uncertainty, a faint pulse, a pattern, sometimes a trick of current or marine life. But when it was real, adrenaline surged through the crew. Commands rippled across the ship. Contact bearing steady. The hunt began. Sonar men tracked the echoes while officers calculated attack runs. Depth charges were set, ready to fall in precise sequences. And always, the pings continued. Rhythmic, mechanical, relentless. It was in these rooms that the human and the technological merged. A single wrong interpretation could waste hours or cost lives. Too cautious, and the submarine escaped. Too aggressive, and the escort lost contact. Sonar was an art as much as a science. Operators learned to read the ocean's tone, sensing when an echo meant steel and when it meant nothing. In time, they developed instincts, a sixth sense for movement in the deep, realized they could use sound offensively. They began forming hunter-killer groups detached from convoys, often built around escort carriers that launched aircraft to spot periscopes and force U-boats under. Once submerged, the sonar-equipped destroyers moved in. The convoy system was no longer merely a shield. It had become a spear. For the Allies, the sea had transformed into a map of sound. Where U-boat captains trusted stealth, escorts trusted data. Every contact added to growing acoustic libraries, allowing analysts to recognize engine patterns and depth behavior unique to certain submarine types. The Atlantic became a laboratory of constant learning. Naval intelligence worked hand in hand with frontline crews, testing new tactics almost weekly. Success was measured in seconds of sustained contact, in how long a ping could hold before fading. To the men aboard the U-boats, this was incomprehensible. They knew something had changed. That Allied ships could find them faster, track them longer, and strike more accurately. But the cause was unseen. Some believed the Allies had developed a new weapon that could see through water. Others thought spies betrayed their roots. The truth was simpler and more devastating. Science and coordination had fused into a weapon that made the sea itself Allied territory. By early 1943, sonar had matured from an experiment into an instrument of mastery. Allied escorts began to think not of defending, but of purging. They spoke of sweeping lanes and clearing sectors, language that reflected confidence born of precision. Where once convoys trembled in fear, now U-boat crews felt the weight of dread. The ocean that had sheltered them was turning hostile. And deep inside BDU headquarters in occupied France, Admiral Dönitz began to sense that something invisible and unstoppable was listening to his entire fleet. Inside the fortified bunkers of the Kriegsmarine headquarters at Lorient, Admiral Karl Dönitz stared at the daily situation maps, where small red flags marked the positions of his U-boat wolf packs across the Atlantic. For years, those markers had symbolized control, proof that German submarines dominated the world's oceans. But by 1943, the map told a different story. Entire groups had vanished mid-patrol. Radio signals stopped abruptly. Some U-boats left base and were never heard from again. Dönitz's staff blamed luck, weather, or convoy escorts in overwhelming numbers. But the truth was stranger and more terrifying. The Allies had built a web of sound across the sea, and every time a U-boat moved, it echoed within it. Leadership on both sides became a battle of faith. Dönitz believed in the moral resilience of his men, in their training and courage. He had risen from the ranks of the U-boat arm himself, and his command style was deeply personal. He wrote motivational messages to his captains, reminding them that the submarine war was Germany's last hope to cut off Britain's lifeline. "Every torpedo fired is a sword for the Reich," he told them. But words could not reverse physics. The Allies were winning not through speeches, but through relentless collaboration between scientists, engineers, and sailors. Admiral Sir Max Horton, commanding the western approaches in Liverpool, approached the war with analytical precision. He saw convoys as living organisms. Each escort, each sonar array, each radar sweep a cell in a larger body. Under his leadership, escort groups were no longer reactive clusters, but disciplined strike teams. He paired aggressive commanders with patient ones, balancing instinct with restraint. Horton demanded that every U-boat hunted became a lesson studied, not just a kill celebrated. Reports flooded in after every engagement, analyzed within hours by technical staff who refined sonar tactics for the next battle. The process was clinical, systematic, the mirror opposite of the chaos inside a submarine under attack. Technologically, the race was one of microseconds and meters. The Germans continued to rely on stealth and periscope sightings, but the Allies were deploying ships fitted with twin or triple sonar arrays. These could triangulate a U-boat's position with astonishing precision. The old single-beam ASDIC had become an integrated acoustic network. Some destroyer escorts even carried experimental sonar linked to plotting tables that could display the submarine's path in real time, an innovation years ahead of its time. The U-boats, built for ambush, now faced enemies that could anticipate every turn. From the German perspective, the ocean itself began to feel unnatural. Commanders reported strange phenomena, convoys changing course suddenly toward them, escorts appearing exactly where they submerged, depth charges exploding in near-perfect patterns. They suspected radio interception, or even supernatural detection devices. The truth lay in the cold discipline of Allied acoustic warfare. Every sonar ping, every echo, every shift in bearing told a story to men trained to read it. Once a contact was made, the U-boat's movements were mathematically predictable. In the cramped sonar room of an American destroyer escort, it was no longer guesswork. It was geometry. Morale among U-boat crews deteriorated sharply as 1943 progressed. Patrols grew shorter, casualties higher. Sailors began calling the Bay of Biscay the Valley of Death, where aircraft and escorts waited day and night. Few submarines even reached the open ocean before being detected. Letters home carried coded despair, though German censors rarely allowed such words to pass. Crews returned to base haunted, exhausted, and pale from weeks of confinement. Yet new volunteers still came, drawn by propaganda that promised heroism beneath the waves. For many, their first patrol would be their last. Meanwhile, the moral weight of the campaign bore heavily on Allied sailors as well. Escort crews witnessed the aftermath of their own success. Oil slicks stretching for miles, bits of debris, sometimes bodies floating among the wreckage. The enemy they hunted were young men not unlike themselves. Some commanders ordered wreaths dropped at the sight of a sinking, a brief moment of silence for those who would never surface again. The war beneath the waves had stripped away the illusions of glory. It became, for all involved, a contest of endurance between technology and mortality. The psychological contrast was striking. For German commanders, each sinking now carried dread. For Allied escorts, each contact carried resolve. Reports from surviving U-boat crews described the terror of being pinned underwater for hours, while escorts circled above, dropping pattern after pattern of charges. The pressure hull creaked, bolts popped, lights flickered, and the air grew toxic. There was nowhere to run, only to wait, praying the next explosion wouldn't split the hull. To Allied sonar operators, those same hours were tense but controlled. Tracking echoes, adjusting bearings, keeping the pattern steady. One side endured chaos, the other imposed order. This divide, between desperation and method, defined the second half of the Atlantic War. It was no longer a struggle between fleets, but between mindsets. Dönitz's faith in courage and instinct collided with the Allies' faith in mathematics and systems. The U-boat crews fought with bravery. The escorts fought with information. And in modern war, information almost always prevails. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was approaching its breaking point. The hunters who once ruled the sea were being cornered by invisible lines of sound. The sonar arrays had turned the vast Atlantic into a cage of echoes. And within that cage, the climax of the submarine war was about to begin. In the early months of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic reached a level of intensity unseen since the war began. Every crossing had become a gamble between survival and annihilation. The German U-boat command poured everything into one final offensive, deploying over 100 submarines at once across the North Atlantic. Dönitz called it Operation Happy Time Renewed, convinced that numbers alone could overwhelm the convoy's defenses. But this time, the ocean answered back, not with silence, but with sound. In March, convoy HX-229 set out from New York bound for Liverpool, carrying over 40 merchant ships escorted by destroyers and corvettes. The Germans detected it almost immediately through radio interception, and within days, a wolf pack of over 30 U-boats converged. It should have been a massacre. Yet as the battle unfolded, the results defied expectation. Allied escorts held their lines with deadly precision, using continuous sonar sweeps to maintain contact through fog, rain, and darkness. When one ship lost contact, another picked it up seamlessly. It was the first demonstration of the new multi-array coordination, a living sonar net cast across the sea. The U-boat struck hard, sinking several freighters in the opening night. But the escorts countered with unprecedented coordination. The British destroyer HMS Harvester and the corvette HMS Escapade worked in tandem, relaying sonar bearings and depth estimates. When U-432 was detected at 150 feet, both ships attacked from opposite angles, closing the net. The depth charges detonated in a pattern so accurate that U-432 broke apart within minutes. Nearby submarines dove deeper, but the escorts pursued relentlessly, guided by sonar echoes that seemed to reach into the dark itself. The Americans, too, had refined their approach. Destroyer escorts like USS Campbell and USS Spencer now carried the latest QGB sonar with improved signal stability. Operators could hear a U-boat change depth almost instantly, tracking it as if by sight. When a faint echo appeared near HX-229's rear flank, the Spencer moved in alone, cutting across the convoy's wake. Her sonar men adjusted gain levels, isolating a firm contact. Depth charges rolled into the sea. The explosions were timed to detonate at multiple depths, creating a vertical cage of pressure. For the first time, the hunters were being hunted faster than they could flee. The Germans' main strength, coordination, now worked against them. Radio transmissions among wolf packs, once essential for attack planning, betrayed their positions to Allied HEFDF, high-frequency direction finding. The escorts, guided by triangulated bearings, steamed directly toward those signals. It was no longer necessary to wait for torpedo tracks. The chase began before the first shot was fired. The culmination came in May 1943, during convoy ONS-5, the turning point of the Atlantic War. 50 merchant ships and their escorts faced more than 40 U-boats over several days of running battle. The weather was brutal, with snow squalls and 40-foot waves crashing over decks. Yet despite these conditions, Allied sonar remained functional. In fact, the rough seas favored the escorts. The noise masked their approach while sonar pulses cut through the water unhindered. Night after night, the U-boats tried to penetrate the screen. Each time, the escorts' sonar operators caught them. HMS Duncan held contact for over an hour, guiding Hedgehog projectors that fired forward and sank U-119. Another destroyer, HMS Vedette, detected U-125 and drove it to the surface, where it was finished by gunfire. The Germans were bewildered. Their tactics, once unstoppable, were failing completely. Dönitz received frantic reports from his captains. "Convoy defends itself like a fortress," one signaled before being lost. Another wrote, "Sonar follows us through maneuvers, impossible to escape." By the end of the ONS-5 battle, the Allies had lost 12 merchant ships, but the Germans had lost 7 U-boats, nearly a fifth of those committed. Statistically, the ratio was catastrophic. For every freighter sunk, a submarine went down. The significance was not in the numbers alone, but in what they represented. E-convoys had transformed from prey into predators. Allied escorts no longer reacted. They anticipated. Their formations were tighter, their sonar coverage broader, their attacks synchronized. Every U-boat contact added to the shared understanding of how to destroy the next. The men who fought these battles described an eerie transformation in the ocean itself. You could almost feel it breathing. One American sonar operator recalled, "The echoes came alive. They told you where he was, how deep, what speed. It was like hearing a heartbeat." For U-boat sailors, the experience was opposite. The ocean that once protected them now betrayed every motion. Even silence could not save them. A stationary boat could still be outlined by its shape in sonar reflection. As May drew to a close, losses became unbearable for the Kriegsmarine. 41 U-boats were sunk in that month alone, the worst in the war. Dönitz, forced to face reality, withdrew his remaining forces from the North Atlantic, marking what Allied commanders called Black May. It was the moment the balance broke. The wolf packs had been broken by patience, precision, and the relentless hum of sonar. Yet for the men aboard those escorts, the war was far from over. The sonar screens still flickered with faint returns, whispers from the depths where death hid in silence. And as summer began, the Allies carried their newfound confidence into the heart of the hunt, determined to finish what they had begun. When May 1943 ended, the North Atlantic seemed to exhale. For the first time in years, convoys crossed without losing ships. Yet for those who sailed its waters, the silence felt unnatural. Every creak of steel, every hum of a sonar pulse reminded them that somewhere beneath, remnants of the wolf packs still lurked. The battle had not ended. It had simply changed its shape. The Allies pressed their advantage ruthlessly. What had begun as a defensive struggle now turned into a full-scale offensive against the U-boat arm. Escort carriers, armed with sonar-equipped aircraft, expanded the reach of detection far beyond the convoy lanes. Destroyers, now trained to operate in hunter-killer groups, roamed freely, guided not by the presence of merchant ships, but by sonar contacts and decrypted radio traffic. The ocean, once vast and anonymous, was now charted by invisible waves of sound. In June, the USS Bogue Group, a collection of one carrier and several destroyer escorts, swept across the mid-Atlantic. Sonar operators aboard the destroyer USS George reported a faint contact at dawn, a distant echo returning every few seconds. It might have been a whale, or it might have been steel. The group turned toward it. Aircraft from the Bogue circled overhead, scanning the surface for signs of a periscope. Moments later, the sonar echo grew stronger. "Bearing steady," came the report. Depth charges splashed into the sea, followed by a deep, rolling detonation that shook the hull. Oil and fragments rose to the surface. Another U-boat gone. But even as victories accumulated, the men who fought them began to understand the strange intimacy of this new warfare. They never saw the enemy's face. Their entire battle was waged through sound, beeps, echoes, and fade-in G pulses that represented lives hidden in the dark. Some operators admitted to feeling haunted by the final moments before a kill, the echo that grew frantic, then stopped forever. You could almost hear them trying to escape, one recalled quietly. And then it was just silence. For the Germans, silence had once been their greatest weapon. Now it became their prison. U-boat captains were ordered to dive deeper, to move slower, to trust stealth rather than aggression. But even stealth had limits. The new Allied sonar, refined by combat, could detect changes in thermoclines, layers of water with different temperatures, where submarines tried to hide. The ocean itself was no longer neutral. It became an ally to those who could interpret its secrets. In Berlin, Dönitz raged at reports of mounting losses. He ordered new designs, Type White 1 and 23 submarines, faster and quieter. But they would come too late. For now, his crews sailed into slaughter. "The Atlantic is closing around us," one commander wrote in his log before departing. "We are being hunted by ghosts." Those ghosts were the Allied hunter-killer groups, moving with terrifying precision. The USS Card, USS Croatan, and HMS Vindex all carried aircraft equipped with sonobuoys, floating sensors that were to 600 feet and still be heard, tracked, and cornered. When sonar contact was lost, magnetic anomaly detectors picked it up. There was nowhere left to hide. By the summer's end, the tone of German radio transmissions shifted from confidence to despair. Crews began refusing to surface, choosing to scuttle their boats rather than face depth charges. Some convoys reported no attacks at all, an unimaginable outcome a year earlier. The North Atlantic, once a graveyard for Allied shipping, was now a trap for submarines. Yet victory came at a human cost. Allied sailors lived in constant tension, ears straining for the faintest sound. Sleep was rare. Many developed tinnitus from the endless sonar pings. The destroyer's decks reeked of cordite and salt. The air buzzed with fatigue and fear. "We didn't cheer when we sank one," a British officer said later. "You just watched the oil rise, and you thought, there go 50 men, all swallowed by the same sea we trust to carry us home." In one haunting encounter, HMS Starling, under Captain Frederick Walker, detected a U-boat at dawn. The chase lasted 8 hours. Each time the U-boat tried to evade, sonar reacquired it. Walker's ships fired 250 depth charges in total. Finally, U-202 surfaced, crippled, her crew spilling onto the deck. They waved white flags, but the sea was too rough for rescue. The submarine rolled and sank, taking most of its men with it. The British sailors stood in silence as debris drifted past. The victory felt hollow. By the end of 1943, the tide of war had turned completely. The Allies had gained mastery not through overwhelming numbers, but through understanding, of sound, of patience, of the psychology of the hunt. They had turned the sea itself into a weapon. In the dim sonar rooms of those ships, where young men listened to the ocean for hours on end, a strange realization took root. Technology had not only changed warfare, it had changed perception. The ocean was no longer endless or unknowable. It had become mapped by rhythm, by echo, by the steady pulse of machines and minds working together. And somewhere in that rhythm, in that endless conversation between surface and depth, lay the soul of the Atlantic War, an invisible duel fought between those who listened and those who tried not to be heard. When night fell, the waves rolled again, cold and indifferent, washing away the traces of battle. But beneath the surface, the echoes remained, tiny, fading signatures of the greatest undersea hunt the world had ever known. By early 1944, the scale of change in the Atlantic War could finally be measured in hard numbers, and in the quiet that followed. In less than a year, Germany's once formidable U-boat fleet had been broken, not by sheer firepower, but by the invisible precision of Allied sonar, radar, and code-breaking working in harmony. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had once seemed endless, was now tilting irrevocably toward Allied control. The statistics told a grim story. In 1943 alone, Germany lost 237 U-boats, more than half of its operational strength. Thousands of sailors vanished beneath the waves, often without a single survivor. For the first time since the war began, the Atlantic convoys were crossing with minimal losses. Merchant ship sinkings dropped from over 600 in 1942 to fewer than 100 a year later. The ocean that had once devoured Allied tonnage now carried men, fuel, and weapons west to east with growing confidence. At Allied naval command centers, maps of the Atlantic were no longer marked with red circles of lost ships. Instead, blue pins spread steadily across the ocean, the routes of safe convoys, the lines of new hunter-killer patrols, the expanding arcs of sonar coverage. The rhythm of the war had changed. Every successful crossing meant more supplies for the D-Day buildup, more aircraft, more tanks, and more hope. Behind every victory in Europe that followed, from Normandy to the Rhine, stood this silent triumph of logistics and technology. For the men who had fought it, the aftermath carried mixed emotions. On the Allied side, there was relief and exhaustion. Sailors who had once spent every night listening for torpedoes could finally sleep without fear. But the memory of the hunted enemy lingered. They knew the ocean still held the wrecks of hundreds of submarines, each one a tomb sealed by pressure and darkness. When sonar operators heard faint echoes near known wreck sites, they sometimes turned off their equipment out of respect. The sound of silence felt sacred. In Germany, the defeat struck like a hammer. Admiral Dönitz, who had believed that submarines could choke Britain into submission, now faced the reality that his fleet was dying faster than he could replace it. The Atlantic, once his hunting ground, had become a graveyard. He blamed technology gaps, the delayed production of new, faster boats. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Allies had learned faster, listened better, and built a machine of war that thought in sound. "Our boats are no longer invisible," he wrote bitterly in his war diary. "They are heard before they are seen." The surviving U-boat crews returned to Port Gaunt, hollow-eyed and silent. Their bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, once symbols of triumph, were now battered ruins under constant Allied bombing. German officers who had once boasted of total tonnage sunk now spoke only of endurance. The youngest sailors, some barely 19, came home with the 1,000-yard stare of men who had lived months in darkness. In the end, fewer than 1 in 4 U-boat men survived the war, one of the highest casualty rates of any branch in modern history. On the Allied side, the technological success reshaped naval doctrine forever. Sonar had proven that sound was more than a tool. It was a new dimension of warfare. Navies began designing ships around acoustic performance. Training programs for sonar operators expanded, blending engineering with intuition. The lessons of the Atlantic became the foundation of post-war anti-submarine warfare, a science that would dominate the oceans for the next 50 years. Yet even in victory, there was no celebration at sea. The sailors who returned to Halifax, Liverpool, and Boston found their cities decorated with flags, but their own thoughts were quieter. They had seen what the ocean did to men, friend and foe alike, They understood that beneath the statistics lay stories of courage, fatigue, and fear shared by all who entered that gray world. As 1944 unfolded, the Allied command shifted focus toward Europe's liberation. But the men of the Atlantic War carried with them a different kind of victory, one not marked by parades or medals, but by the knowledge that their endurance had opened the path to invasion. The sea was secure, the supply lines were alive, and the tide, at last, was turning toward the final reckoning. The war's most silent battlefield had gone quiet, but its echoes still reached across every front line. The collapse of the U-boat threat reshaped the entire course of World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic, once considered unwinnable, had been transformed by coordination and technology into a demonstration of Allied unity at its finest. With the sea lanes open, the Atlantic became a bridge rather than a barrier, a living artery that carried the lifeblood of victory. Millions of tons of supplies, thousands of aircraft, and endless columns of tanks and fuel now crossed unimpeded, ensuring that the invasion of Europe could not fail for lack of material. The silent war beneath the waves had determined the fate of the battles on land. Behind this triumph stood thousands of unsung figures: engineers, scientists, cryptanalysts, and sonar operators, whose names never appeared in newspapers. Men and women at laboratories in Britain and America refined the delicate art of underwater acoustics, studying how sound moved through temperature layers, salinity, and pressure. They built devices sensitive enough to distinguish a whale's heartbeat from a submarine's propeller. Each discovery fed back into the convoy escorts, making them sharper, faster, more efficient. The Allied war machine had achieved something unprecedented, a perfect harmony of intellect and courage. In British coastal towns, where convoys had once limped into port bearing scars of battle, the mood shifted from dread to gratitude. Dock war. Kears no longer counted the missing ships, but marveled at the sheer volume arriving safely. Shipyards that had worked day and night repairing torpedoed hulls now turned to building new vessels. Not replacements for losses, but reinforcements for victory. Newspapers carried headlines like, "U-boat menace crushed," and "Atlantic now safe for convoys." But beneath the headlines, veterans of the escort fleet kept their own counsel. They had learned that the sea never truly forgave arrogance. For Germany, the aftermath was a slow and bitter reckoning. By the beginning of 1945, the once mighty U-boat arm was a ghost of itself. Its remaining boats operated in isolation, rarely communicating, surfacing only at night to avoid radar. Crews were composed of teenagers and old sailors recalled from retirement. The ocean that had once offered adventure now promised almost certain death. The new Type 21 submarines, faster and quieter than anything before, were too late to change the outcome. Only a handful ever saw action. The rest sat unfinished in bombed shipyards, monuments to a lost gamble. Dönitz, who briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state in the final days of the war, could only watch as his dream of undersea dominance evaporated. In his memoirs, he would later admit that he had underestimated Allied science and the speed of innovation. "The sea itself turned against us," he wrote, "for it carried their sounds farther than our silence could hide." After the surrender, Allied divers explored the wreck sites scattered across the Atlantic. What they found was haunting. Submarines lay twisted and broken on the seabed, their hulls still sealed, their crews entombed. Some lay upright, as if waiting to rise again. Others were split open, their torpedoes still inside. Many were never found at all, their last positions lost to the deep. Even today, those wrecks remain untouched, preserved by cold and darkness, the last witnesses to a war of sound and fear. The technology born from that conflict would shape the Cold War era that followed. Sonar evolved into more advanced systems. Passive arrays, variable depth sensors, and long-range detection networks stretching across oceans. The lessons learned chasing U-boats became the blueprint for a new kind of global vigilance. Where once convoys listened for torpedoes, now nations listened for nuclear submarines. The ghosts of the Atlantic had taught the world that victory beneath the sea belonged not to the boldest, but to the most patient listeners. And yet, amid all this progress, a quiet melancholy lingered. At memorials in Britain, Canada, and Germany, survivors gathered in silence each year to remember those who never surfaced. They shared no hatred, only understanding. For both sides had lived through the same darkness, the same crushing depths, the same fear of an unseen enemy. "The sea is fair to all," one British sailor said at a reunion. "It takes without asking sides." By the time peace returned, the Atlantic seemed to breathe again. The sonar pings that once marked death now guided ships safely through fog and storm. The same sound that had once hunted men now saved them. The ocean, in its vast memory, had absorbed the echoes of war and turned them into lessons, reminders of what human minds could achieve and of what human lives could endure. The Battle of the Atlantic was over, but its legacy of innovation, endurance, and the eternal struggle between silence and detection would ripple across history long after the last wreck had rusted away in the quiet deep. When the Atlantic finally went still, it was not victory that sailors felt first. It was relief. The ocean had taken so many that even triumph felt muted, like the calm that follows a long storm. Yet within that silence lay the proof of something extraordinary: humanity's ability to adapt, to listen, and to turn even the unseen into understanding. The sonar pings that once marked the difference between life and death had taught the world a lesson deeper than the sea itself. The Battle of the Atlantic was never just a contest of machines. It was a struggle between fear and reason, between the darkness of uncertainty and the light of discovery. Every U-boat that slipped beneath the waves carried men who believed in the power of stealth. Every escort ship that hunted them carried men who believed in the power of knowledge. In the end, knowledge prevailed, not through cruelty, but through persistence, patience, and an unshakable trust in the minds that listened hardest. The Allied sonar arrays, once crude and experimental, became symbols of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with brute force, but with precision and insight. They revealed that the greatest victories are often won in silence by those willing to wait, to learn, and to hear what others cannot. In this sense, the sonar war beneath the Atlantic was not merely a military triumph, but a human one. It transformed sound into survival, science into salvation. Today, the ocean still holds the remains of that struggle, the twisted metal resting quietly under miles of cold water, the faint echoes of pings long faded. Divers who visit these wrecks speak of a profound stillness, as if the sea itself remembers what happened there. Perhaps it does. The ocean forgets nothing. It only grows quieter. And so the story of the U-boats and the sonar hunters endures, not as a tale of domination, but as a reminder that every advance in war carries the weight of those who paid for it. The men who listened in the dark changed history, not through destruction, but through understanding. In that sense, the Atlantic's deepest victory was not over the enemy. It was over ignorance itself.